When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stops at a diner in rural Alabama, she's denied service. Not because of what she ordered, but because of who she is and what she represents. The refusal triggers a clash tied to a 57-year-old wrongful arrest involving her mother, forcing the town to confront a history it's tried to forget. What starts as quiet humiliation turns into a public reckoning that leaves the owner shaken, a veteran apologizing, and the whole community forever changed. In the moment that cracked the silence, what did Jasmine say? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Fresh from a grueling discrimination hearing in Georgia, Jasmine Crockett pulled into the lot of Dale's Diner. Just a roadside pit stop, nothing more. But nothing in Elmswood, Alabama ever stayed simple for long. The diner squatted at the corner of a quiet street, like a monument to everything this country hadn't resolved. Faded red siding, a neon sign that blinked Southern proud, and a sun-bleached Confederate flag decal curled at the edge of the window. Inside, a dusty radio played a mournful country tune, while the hum of old men in worn flannel filled the air like static. Jasmine stepped out, heels clicking against the cracked pavement, her navy suit still sharp from Capitol Hill. She wasn't here to make a statement, just to grab a bite and head home. But in this town, her presence was already a headline. She pushed the door open, the overhead bell ringing out like an alarm. And just like that, the air changed. The conversations didn't stop. They staggered. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Heads turned one by one, slow and calculating, like spotlights sweeping a dark stage. Jasmine moved toward the counter with quiet composure, but the tension wrapped around her like a second skin. The waitress behind the register, young, blonde with nervous eyes, looked to the back as if searching for backup. A pair of farmers by the window leaned in closer to whisper. One man in a camouflage jacket didn't even hide his smirk. Jasmine offered a polite nod and a "good morning," but no one answered. The room had decided she didn't belong, and they didn't need to say it out loud. Her dignity was the only thing keeping her standing upright, because everything else in that room was working overtime to push her out the door. She stood still, spine straight, eyes forward, surrounded but not shaken. The weight in the room wasn't loud. It was heavier than noise. It was the kind of weight that tells you your presence is a disruption, even if no one says it aloud. Jasmine could feel it pressing against her chest as if the walls themselves were warning her to leave. Then came the soft squeak of hinges and a quiet shift in the air. From the swinging kitchen door, a man emerged, late 50s, with graying hair slicked back and a sweat-stained apron caked in flour. His boots thudded softly against the linoleum as he crossed the floor with the casual confidence of someone who'd been in charge of this place longer than anyone dared question. His name tag said Dale, but it wasn't necessary. The room had already deferred to him. Dale didn't smile. He didn't ask what she wanted. He didn't offer a seat or a menu. He just stopped a few feet from her, dish towel still in hand, and looked at her the way people look at a problem they've decided not to fix. There was no malice in his face, only the cold certainty of someone who felt no need to explain himself. Then calmly, as if he were commenting on the weather, he said, "I'm sorry, but we can't serve you here." The words were simple. The meaning was not. They came with history, with weight, with a message written between the lines. You're not one of us. You never were. And no matter how you speak, dress, or carry yourself, this place is not for you. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink, but something in her chest pulled tighter. A familiar ache, rage, grief, and restraint, all twisted into one. She'd been here before. Not this town, not this building, but this moment. The one where respectability means nothing, where accomplishment can't shield you, where your very presence is treated like trespassing. And as she met Dale's eyes, steady and silent, she understood. This wasn't about policy or politics or even who she was. It was about who they'd already decided she couldn't be. The air between them held still, thick with everything Dale didn't want to say out loud. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. Her voice, calm but sharpened by something older than this moment, cut straight through the tension. "May I ask why?" she said, each word deliberate, quiet but impossible to ignore. Dale shifted his weight slightly, eyes flicking toward the booths behind her, before settling back on hers. There was hesitation in the pause, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew exactly what he meant and didn't want to be the one to say it plain. "It's just," he began, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck, "we don't really mix politics with breakfast around here. Folks come in to feel comfortable, not challenged. And people in this town, they've got strong feelings about what you stand for." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The implication hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Visible, acrid, and unmistakably intentional. Jasmine held his gaze. No anger, no sarcasm, just a single nod, slow and controlled, as if cataloging every layer of hypocrisy she'd seen play out in rooms like this one for decades. She'd been labeled many things in her life: lawyer, congresswoman, activist, but here this morning, in this room, she was being reduced to a threat. Not for anything she said, not for anything she did, but for existing in the space at all. Then it came, the break, the moment where disdain stopped pretending to be discomfort. From the back corner, a voice pierced the silence with calculated cruelty. "She's that troublemaker, isn't she?" A young man, maybe late 20s, slouched in his booth like he owned the place. Boots muddy and jacket ripped at the collar. He didn't say it to her face. He said it at her, like a rock tossed from a safe distance. "Saw her on TV once, screaming her head off, stirring up the kind of mess that turns towns like this upside down." A few chuckles followed, not loud but loud enough, and no one, not one person, told him to stop. That was the part that always hit the hardest, not the words themselves, but the silence that came after. The consent it carried. Jasmine turned slowly and without blinking toward the voice. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because in that moment, her stillness was louder than all of them combined. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't blink. And most of all, she didn't get angry, because that's what they expected. That's what they were waiting for. Her silence unnerved them more than shouting ever could. The room, thick with judgment and tension, held its breath. Dale stood in front of her, arms crossed, jaw clenched, the unspoken weight of his position resting heavily in his posture. But Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. It didn't ask for understanding. It demanded clarity. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, but every syllable was deliberate, pressed out with the weight of 1,000 similar moments that had come before this one. "If I'm being turned away because of who I am," she said slowly, "then I think it's only fair that I hear that from the person who actually owns this place, not someone hired to speak for her." The room stilled. The kind of stillness that doesn't happen because people are listening, but because they've just been exposed. She hadn't raised her voice, but it cut through the air like a blade. No theatrics, no performance, just truth, spoken plainly, standing alone without apology. And that was what made it land so hard. Dale blinked. It was a blink that betrayed the shift, small but real. His shoulders dropped a fraction, the firmness in his stance beginning to slip. He wasn't used to being confronted without being attacked. He wasn't used to someone asking for the truth and doing it with such terrifying calm. The waitress behind the counter looked away, suddenly very interested in organizing sugar packets. Two men in a booth exchanged glances, but said nothing. And the young man in the back, the one who had laughed earlier, now leaned back just slightly, as if unsure whether to enjoy what was happening or prepare for something else entirely. Jasmine stayed still. She had no need to move. The burden was no longer hers. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't even asking for justice. What she asked for was far more uncomfortable: accountability. Dale hesitated, his lips parted, searching for something, an excuse, a way to soften what had just been exposed. But none came. Not one word could cover what had already been made plain. Finally, he exhaled, a sound more like resignation than relief, and gave a small, reluctant nod. "All right," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'll call her." And just like that, the illusion cracked. He turned and walked toward the back, through the kitchen doors, leaving behind the uncomfortable silence of a room full of people who had just watched a woman stand her ground. Not with anger, not with threats, but with the kind of stillness that speaks louder than any shout, and they all heard it, whether they wanted to or not. The door to the kitchen had barely stopped swinging when the murmur of voices returned, not as background noise this time, but as a quiet swarm, coiled tight with discomfort. No one dared speak directly to her, but the whispers were louder now, more pointed. Words were no longer casual, they were calculated. They drifted across the room in fragments, half muttered, fully intended. She's looking for trouble. Why'd she even come here? Always gotta make it political. The air felt different, tighter. It wasn't just the tension anymore. It was resistance, a collective pressure from the room, like a body bracing for something it didn't want to face. Jasmine sat alone at the counter, her back straight, her fingers gently resting on the black leather of her case. She didn't look around. She didn't flinch. Stillness for her was not surrender. It was strategy, a shield built from years of being judged before she spoke, dismissed before she stood, condemned before she arrived. From the corner booth near the window, a chair creaked. An older man shifted forward, resting both elbows heavily on the table, as if his entire body were made of weariness. His voice broke the hush, not loud, but unmistakably intended to carry. "We buried sons in this town," he said, his eyes not on Jasmine, but on some fixed point just past her shoulder. "Sons who bled on foreign soil. We didn't send them off to die so they could come back to a country torn apart by voices like yours." It wasn't a shout. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of statement meant to sound reasonable, measured, even noble. But the edges were jagged, and every word carried the weight of accusation disguised as patriotism. Jasmine didn't speak. Her jaw didn't tighten. Her hands didn't move. But her silence wasn't passive. It was the silence of someone who had heard this script before, who had memorized every line of it, every pause, every coded phrase. Ray, his name stitched in fading thread across a worn cap, didn't smirk. He didn't sneer. That would have made it easier to dismiss. No, what made his words land so hard was their calm delivery, as if he truly believed he was stating something honorable, as if his loss, his history, his grief gave him a license to silence her, as if pain gave permission for prejudice. Jasmine sat with perfect stillness, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood the cost of saying it. A black woman raising her voice in a room like this doesn't get heard. She gets labeled. She becomes the headline, the problem, the one who started it. So instead, she let the weight of her silence do the talking. She kept her hands folded gently atop the document case in front of her, a case filled with sworn testimony, legal files, and the truth she had spent years gathering. And yet here she was, still being asked to prove she belonged. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was memory. It was strategy. It was resistance. And for everyone in that room who had hoped she would snap, who had waited for the permission to point and say, "See, she's one of those," her silence denied them that. She didn't need to meet Ray's eyes. The room had already felt her answer. "No, your sons didn't die so people like me could be erased quietly. No, your loss doesn't make this world yours alone. No, your sacrifice doesn't excuse shutting out a voice just because it dares to name injustice." And still, she said none of that aloud. She didn't need to, because somehow doing nothing, absolutely nothing, was more powerful than if she had said everything. The door opened again, this time slower, as if the air itself had thickened since Dale walked through it. What came next was not just a person, but a presence, a shift, a signal that the decision wouldn't be passed off anymore. Helen stepped into the room like someone who knew exactly what kind of place she was walking into, because she had built it with her own hands. 60, maybe older, with silver hair twisted into a tight knot at the base of her neck. She wore the uniform of someone who still worked the line. White apron dusted with flour, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a faint streak of grease near the collarbone. Her face was firm, lined not just by age but by years of being the one who made the final call when no one else would. Her eyes were sharp, alert, not angry, not welcoming, just calculating. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. First, she looked at Jasmine, head to toe, not in judgment, but in assessment, like a carpenter measuring material she wasn't sure would fit the frame. Then her gaze swept the room. Quick, clean, precise. She saw everything. The way the waitress froze with the pot still in her hand, the stiff posture of Ray in the booth near the window, the pointed silence of the young man in the back, who'd earlier cracked a joke but now stared at his phone, scrolling nothing. She saw it all and said nothing, because she already knew. Jasmine rose slowly from her stool. There was no performance in it, no theatrics, just a movement done with the kind of grace that makes people realize too late that they've misread the moment. She faced Helen directly, hands still resting lightly on her briefcase, spine straight. The hush in the room was total now, dense, expectant, almost suffocating. And then Jasmine spoke, her voice clear, steady, and painfully human. "I came here today as a citizen," she said, not a flicker of defensiveness in her tone. Not as a congresswoman, not as a lawyer, not as someone looking to prove anything, just a woman traveling through looking for a meal and a moment of peace. She let the words settle. No rush, no panic. Then she continued, her voice still calm, but carrying something deeper now, a tired truth. "But if this place already decided what I am before I even placed an order, if your mind, or theirs, was made up the second I walked through that door," she drew a breath, "then I think I deserve to understand why. I'm not here to argue, I'm not here to demand. But if I'm not welcome, I want to hear that truth plainly. Because if people like me can't even ask for breakfast without suspicion, then we're not just talking about politics anymore. We're talking about something much older than that." There it was. Not an accusation, not a plea, just reality, spoken without apology. And it changed the temperature in the room. She didn't tremble. She didn't raise her chin or square her shoulders like she was gearing for a fight. She simply stood in full view, unarmed but undefeated. And in that stillness, the weight of everything she carried, history, expectation, scrutiny, pressed in, not just on her, but on everyone watching. The room wasn't quiet because it respected her. It was quiet because it didn't know what to do with someone who refused to shrink. And Helen just stood there, eyes locked with Jasmine's, as if trying to decide whether this woman in front of her was a threat or a test, or both. Helen didn't blink. She stood there, her posture as firm as the walls surrounding them, the faintest trace of flour still dusting her apron. The air between them felt heavier now, as if the weight of every word spoken and unsaid was pressing down all at once. Jasmine could feel it, could sense the quiet judgment building in the room, the collective exhale, the shift in the air. She knew what was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. Helen's gaze didn't waver, her voice cutting through the silence with deliberate calm. "In this town," she said, her words measured but resolute, "many people see you as a symbol of division, not unity." Jasmine's heart didn't race. Her pulse didn't speed up. But inside, something shifted. The air around her thickened, and the sting of the words settled deep within her chest. This wasn't just a rejection. It wasn't even about her politics or her presence in the diner. This was something deeper, something that felt older than the town, older than the country itself. Helen wasn't just speaking for herself. She was voicing the collective frustration of every person in this room. Every person who had chosen comfort over change, division over conversation. Jasmine stood still, her fingers still resting lightly on her briefcase, a faint reminder of who she was and what she represented. And as Helen's words sank in, she realized that the deeper cut was in how easily Helen had dismissed her. Not for what she had said, but for what she was perceived to stand for. A person reduced to a symbol of everything this town feared. The words didn't shock her. They were familiar. They were echoes of conversations she had heard in different places, different times, the language of division, the choice to label someone as the other rather than trying to understand. She had heard it all before, from strangers, from allies who didn't want to be challenged, from people who believed that standing still meant safety. Helen wasn't speaking about her as a person. She was speaking about her as a concept, as a mirror to the parts of this country that still refused to look at itself in the light of truth. Jasmine didn't argue. She didn't need to. The truth was laid bare in Helen's words, in the way the room shifted when she walked in the way they had already decided who she was before she even spoke. It wasn't a rejection of her actions, of her voice. It was a rejection of the very idea that change could be brought by people like her. It was a refusal to confront what was broken and a preference for the comfortable, stagnant quiet that came from avoiding the hard questions. And yet, even as the weight of Helen's words settled in, Jasmine didn't feel defeated. She felt something else, determined. Because no matter how many times people chose division over conversation, no matter how many times they refused to see the truth she carried with her, Jasmine knew one thing. She would never stop showing up. The room had settled into an eerie quiet, the kind that precedes an inevitable storm. Helen's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick with judgment and unspoken history. Jasmine's hands rested calmly on the counter, but her mind was anything but still. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had been dismissed by this town before. She had faced rejection from systems far larger than this diner, but today was different. Today, the injustice she faced wasn't from a policy, a law, or even a headline. It was from a generation's worth of fear, hate, and misunderstandings that had been passed down without ever being confronted. Jasmine knew that she had to stand firm, but she didn't need to shout. She didn't need to challenge them with anger. She had seen too many people try to fight this kind of battle with bitterness and resentment. It didn't work. What would work, what had always worked, was the truth. It was the truth they had all avoided, the truth they had tried to bury under years of silence. But she wasn't going to let that happen today. With a slow, deliberate motion, she opened her briefcase and took out a folded piece of paper. The edges were frayed with time, the yellowing of the paper a quiet testament to its age. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a letter that had been kept in her family's possession for decades, a letter that represented so much more than just words on a page. It was a letter from Helen's father, a man she had only ever known in stories that her mother had shared with her late at night. He had been the sheriff of Elmswood in 1966, the man who had orchestrated the wrongful arrest of Jasmine's mother, a moment that had torn their lives apart and left scars that still hadn't fully healed. Jasmine placed the letter gently on the counter, her fingers brushing over the faded ink as she did. She didn't look at Helen when she spoke next, but her words cut through the room like a blade. There was no venom in her voice, no accusation, just the calm, unshakable resolve of someone who had carried this weight for years and was finally choosing to set it down. "I didn't come here for vengeance," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I came here because I believe in the power of forgiveness, and I believe in the power of dialogue, not just between politicians or law enforcement, but between people, real people, who have been hurt by the same things, who have been misunderstood by the same things." She paused, letting her words hang in the space between them. This wasn't just about a letter or about the past. It was about an invitation to step out of the comfort of old prejudices and look at the truth for what it was. Not as something to be feared, but as something that could heal. The letter, placed delicately on the counter, wasn't just an apology. It was a bridge that connected the two women, not through the space of their current lives, but through the deep, painful history that had brought them here. It was a recognition that no matter how much time had passed, the wrongs could be acknowledged, could be forgiven. Jasmine had lived with that forgiveness, had learned to carry it in her heart, even when it was the hardest thing she could have done. "And this," Jasmine continued, her eyes finally meeting Helen's with quiet strength, "isn't about what happened to my family in 1966. This is about what happens next. If we keep ignoring the past, if we keep pretending it didn't happen, if we keep letting fear and resentment divide us, then we're going to lose something much bigger than just our trust in each other. We'll lose the chance to truly understand one another." Helen's gaze faltered for a moment, a flicker of something passing across her face. It wasn't guilt or shame, it was recognition. Recognition of a truth that had been hidden behind the walls of this diner for years. The room, once thick with division, felt different now. Heavier, yes, but also lighter. as if the space had opened up just a little. Helen looked at the letter, her fingers twitching slightly as if she wanted to reach out but hesitated. For the first time since entering, Jasmine felt the shifting of something in the room. A subtle, almost imperceptible change in the energy. The walls weren't as solid as they had been when she walked in. Helen hadn't dismissed her. Not yet. Jasmine wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was asking for understanding, a willingness to listen, to see beyond the labels, the history, and the hurt. The letter from Helen's father wasn't a key to unlock all of Elmswood's pain, but it was a crack, a possibility for something different. And as Jasmine stood there, calm, with her truth laid bare in front of them all, the most important thing she had done was simply to show up, unafraid, unwilling to be silenced, and ready to stand for something bigger than the fight itself. The room had frozen in a silence so thick it felt like time had paused, not for effect, but from the sheer weight of what had just been placed on the counter. Jasmine's words, her presence, the faded letter from a former sheriff now long gone. It had all cracked the air like thunder. But it wasn't Jasmine who moved next. It wasn't Helen, not Dale, not even the ones who had whispered or sneered just moments ago. It was the soft scrape of a chair, slow and deliberate, that broke the spell. Every head turned toward the sound, as though pulled by a single string of instinct. From the corner booth near the window, the booth people usually left alone, not out of rudeness but respect, a figure rose, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore. She wasn't just a regular. She was an institution, the kind of woman who had attended every town council meeting for 30 years, brought casseroles to funerals, and still wrote handwritten Christmas cards to veterans' families she didn't personally know. She stood slowly, her joints clearly stiff with age, but her spine held dignity. Her white hair was coiled in a tight French twist, her blouse neatly pressed, a small silver cross at her neck that glinted in the light. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. The act of her rising alone seemed to hush the room further, not from fear, but from memory. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was clear and calm, weathered but strong, like the ring of a church bell at dusk. "I saw her mother once," she began, her eyes on Jasmine and no one else. "Selma. March 1965. I was 19. Standing on Water Avenue." A ripple moved through the room. Not a noise, just a subtle shift in the air, as if history itself had stepped inside. "My father took me there, against my mother's wishes, said I needed to see what conviction looked like. We didn't march, but we stood, watching." She paused, and her fingers lightly curled around the back of the chair in front of her, as if grounding herself in something far older than the wood. "I remember the heat. I remember the silence. But most of all, I remember her mother's face." Jasmine didn't move. Her breath slowed, but her posture didn't change. Her eyes stayed fixed on the woman now standing as her witness. "She wasn't yelling," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "She wasn't chanting. She didn't carry a sign. She walked, head high, shoulders square, her hands by her sides. There was no anger in her, just focus, just grace. And not once, not for a moment, did she look afraid." The room felt as if it had stopped breathing. "I see that same posture now, right in front of me," Mrs. Whitmore said. "You're not here to divide anyone. You're here because that's what your family taught you, to show up, to stand still when the world tries to make you sit down, just like she did." No one spoke. No one even stirred. Even the air conditioner, which had been humming steadily for the last half hour, seemed to hold its breath. For a brief moment, the divide between the past and present disappeared. Jasmine was no longer just a congresswoman or an outsider or a woman asking for coffee in a place that didn't want to see her. She was a continuation, a thread in a long, unbroken line of quiet resistance. A daughter whose story began before she was born, written in blood, protest, forgiveness, and survival. Mrs. Whitmore slowly lowered herself back into her seat. No flourish, no smile. She didn't look around for approval. She simply folded her hands in her lap, stared straight ahead, and sat like a woman who had seen something sacred and decided she would not allow others to forget it. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, no longer defensive, but reflective. Helen's eyes were still on the letter, but her jaw had slackened slightly. Dale glanced toward the back, unsure of what to do with his hands. The young man in the booth, the one who had mocked Jasmine earlier, now stared at the table like it might offer him a way out of his own discomfort. Even Ray, the grizzled vet who had spoken with such certainty, had nothing left to say. Because there, in the voice of an elderly woman who remembered the march and remembered the mother, was the undeniable thread connecting the moment they were in to a truth they could no longer deny. And for the first time since Jasmine had walked through that door, no one could pretend this was just about breakfast anymore. The silence that followed Mrs. Whitmore's words was no longer the kind born of tension. It was reverent, almost sacred. Something had shifted in the room, but no one could yet name it. The people inside Dale's diner, for the first time that morning, weren't reacting. They were listening, truly listening. Not to defend, not to argue, but because they had just heard something they hadn't expected. History spoken from memory, not from a textbook or a headline, but from someone who had stood there. Someone who had seen a young black woman walk through hatred with grace, and had now named that same grace in the woman standing before them. Helen remained standing behind the counter, still as glass, her arms hanging loosely at her sides now. Gone was the rigid posture of a woman protecting her establishment. In its place was something more fragile, contemplation. She stared at the letter on the counter like it was a relic, not a document. A living artifact that forced her to confront not only the actions of her father, but the silence that had followed them. Her father's badge had once hung in the diner's office, framed and polished. She had dusted it every Sunday, but she had never read that letter before. She had never seen her father's handwriting tremble, and now, looking at the daughter of the woman he had once wrongfully imprisoned, she understood why. Her throat moved once in a swallow that seemed to carry more than just discomfort. She didn't speak right away. She looked at Jasmine, not as a threat, not as a headline, but as someone impossibly real. Someone who had carried truth into a place that had survived on avoidance. It took a long time, 30 seconds, maybe more. But then she gave a single nod, slow and deliberate, and when she finally spoke, her voice was stripped of all performance. There was no strength in it, and that made it more honest. "Serve her," she said quietly, not to the room, not even fully to Dale, but to herself. Then more firmly, "And I'll sit with her." A beat passed. It didn't feel like surrender. It felt like surrendering to the truth, something much harder. Dale blinked, startled as if he hadn't expected her to say it out loud. He looked over at her, then at Jasmine, then at the letter, and for a second he looked almost lost. Not because he didn't know what to do next, but because he'd never been told to see her. Not really. She had been a name on TV, a headline, a controversy. Now she was a woman in his diner, and a woman his boss had just told him to serve. His hands moved slowly, as if every motion was suddenly too big. He reached for a mug, white porcelain, chipped at the handle. He held it like it might break. There was no flourish, no friendliness in the way he slid it across the counter toward Jasmine. Just a quiet, almost stunned compliance. For the first time that morning, it was clear. Dale didn't have control anymore, and Jasmine had never needed it. Jasmine, still seated, didn't react right away. She didn't speak. She didn't move. There was no gratitude in her silence, only understanding. She had never demanded to be welcomed. She had asked to be acknowledged. And this, however late, was a beginning. She reached forward with calm, deliberate hands and took the mug, holding it gently for a moment before setting it down beside the letter. Then, just as measured, she rose to her feet. The scrape of her chair echoed against the tile floor, drawing every eye. But she didn't glance around the room. She didn't need to. Helen stepped out from behind the counter, moving like someone carrying weight she hadn't expected to face that morning. Her steps were slow but not hesitant. There was no pride in her gait, but there was a quiet dignity, different from Jasmine's, but dignity nonetheless. She approached the table nearest the front window and pulled out a chair, nodding once to indicate Jasmine should join her. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't an apology. It was a choice, one that had taken 60 years and one letter to make. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't offer absolution. She simply walked over and took the seat opposite Helen, placing her briefcase on the floor beside her, folding her hands atop the table. And in that stillness, something finally broke. Not Jasmine, not Helen, but the wall that had existed between them, the one built by years of silence and assumptions. Across the room, Marcus, the young man who had laughed earlier, his voice so smug only minutes before, was now reduced to stillness. He sat with his arms folded tightly across his chest, but the confidence was gone. He didn't lift his head. He didn't glance toward the table. He stared out the window with the hollow look of someone who had just seen something he couldn't explain and couldn't unsee. His smirk was gone. His posture was smaller now, as if the weight of what he had witnessed had settled on his shoulders too. And no one said a word. There was no applause, no declaration, just the quiet, undeniable truth of two women, one white, one black, one the daughter of a sheriff, one the daughter of a wrongfully arrested woman, now sitting across from each other for the first time, with nothing between them but the past, the present, and the possibility of something better. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. And everyone in that diner knew it. The room had begun to breathe again, but no one quite knew how. After the weight of the letter, the voice of Mrs. Whitmore, and the quiet command in Helen's decision, the world inside Dale's diner felt altered, like something had shifted beneath the floor without anyone seeing it move. And yet it held. Jasmine and Helen now sat face to face at a corner table, the sunlight bleeding softly through the window, cutting across the dust in the air like a spotlight on a scene no one had expected to witness. This wasn't a standoff anymore. It wasn't a debate. It was something far rarer. Two women tethered by history, pulled across generations, trying, despite everything, to understand one another. Helen spoke first. Her hands, once rigid with command, now rested loosely on the table. She didn't fidget, but her fingers curled slightly inward, the way someone does when their defenses have cracked but haven't collapsed. "You remind me of my mother," she said quietly. "She was hard on everyone, but hardest on herself. She'd call that strength. I used to call it being difficult." She exhaled, a small, almost bitter laugh behind her breath. "Now I think I get it." Maybe she was just tired of being told to wait her turn. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She let the words settle, then nodded slowly. "Women like that don't wait well," she said. "They spend their lives pushing against doors that were welded shut before they were born. Sometimes pushing is all they know." She didn't say it to accuse. She said it the way someone names a wound that's been ignored too long, gently but clearly. Her voice held no edge, but no softness either. She wasn't asking to be seen. She was stating that she had always been here. For a few minutes they talked, not about politics, not about parties, not even about the letter. They talked about mothers, about daughters, about what it meant to raise children in a country that still hadn't decided what kind of future it truly wanted. They didn't agree on everything. They didn't try to. Helen spoke of the fear she felt watching the news, watching cities burn, watching words shouted that she didn't understand. Jasmine spoke of the fear she felt walking into rooms where her name arrived before she did. Rooms that had already decided who she was. They didn't trade arguments. They exchanged truths. And in that rare space between them, something else began to build. Something not as heavy as trust, but heavier than tolerance. At one point, Helen looked down at the table and said, almost to herself, "I used to think people like you wanted to tear everything down." Jasmine didn't blink. "I want to know who the house was built for before I start fixing the roof," she replied. Helen nodded, slowly, as if that, somehow, made a kind of sense that no one had ever said out loud to her before. Time passed. Coffee cooled. Conversations resumed quietly at the edges of the room. But no one forgot what was happening in that corner. It was more than a conversation. It was an undoing, and maybe the start of a rebuilding. As Jasmine stood to leave, she reached for her briefcase and paused for a second, just enough to look back at Helen. "Thank you for listening," she said. It wasn't ceremonial, it wasn't diplomatic, it was sincere. Before Helen could reply, A shadow stepped forward from the far side of the diner. Ray. He had watched the entire exchange from a distance, never looking away, never interrupting. The same man who had earlier told her his son hadn't died for a country that allowed people like you to cause chaos, now walked slowly across the room. Not with hesitation, but with the weight of something unspoken. He stopped in front of Jasmine, eyes level, jaw tight. There was no shame in his face, but there was something harder to earn: humility. A veteran's kind, the kind that doesn't bend easily, but knows when it must. I still don't agree with everything you stand for, he said, voice gruff but level. Probably never will. Jasmine waited. But I was wrong about you, he added. I thought you'd come in here loud, demanding, ready for a fight. You didn't. You showed up. You stood still. And you stayed when it got ugly. Most folks don't. His hand, rough with calluses and history, extended slowly toward her. That I can respect. Jasmine looked at the hand for a brief moment, then took it. The handshake was firm, not performative, not for the benefit of anyone watching. Just two people who, for the briefest moment, saw each other not as enemies, but as citizens of the same fractured country, holding opposite truths, but sharing one moment of peace. Ray stepped back without another word. He returned to his seat, but this time he didn't look out the window. As Jasmine turned to leave, the bell above the door chimed gently, just as it had when she entered. But now it sounded different, not like a warning, more like a punctuation mark. She paused in the doorway, looked back one last time, not for validation, not for permission, but to say what needed to be said. We don't have to be the same, she said clearly, her voice reaching every corner of the diner. But we can share the same space, if we're willing to listen. And with that, she walked out. The door closed softly behind her. The sunlight beyond the glass caught the edge of her briefcase as she disappeared down the steps and back into the day. Unchanged in her purpose, but having changed something in the room behind her that would not soon return to what it was. Inside the diner, no one spoke for a long time. Not because there was nothing to say, but because, for the first time, they knew it mattered how they said it. The door clicked shut behind her with a softness that belied the weight of what had just taken place. And still no one moved. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but haunted. The kind that doesn't ask for words because everyone is still trying to remember how to think. In the wake of Jasmine's departure, Dale's diner felt less like a place and more like the hollowed-out shell of one, a building caught mid-transformation between what it had always been and what it could never be again. Plates sat half-finished. Coffee had gone cold. Conversations that had once flowed with easy laughter and local gossip now hovered uncertainly in people's throats. Dale leaned on the counter like he always did, but his fingers tapped against the surface in a restless, uneven rhythm. The usual soundtrack of country radio had gone quiet. He'd forgotten to restart the music after hitting pause. And Helen hadn't moved. She still sat at the table where Jasmine had been. Her posture had shifted, no longer guarded, but emptied. Her hands were folded together on the surface of the wood, resting exactly where Jasmine's mug had once been. The white ceramic was still there, rim stained with a trace of lipstick and silence. Helen stared at it, as if it might still offer answers. The letter, her father's letter, was folded carefully beside it, but she hadn't touched it again. No one dared interrupt her. From the far end of the room, a chair scraped back slowly. Marcus, the young man who had made the first joke, the first smirk, the first judgment, stood awkwardly, his shoulders slouched forward like a man who had just been handed something too heavy to carry. He didn't say a word. He walked to the counter, placed a crumpled 20 beside his untouched plate, then turned to go. Just before he reached the door, he paused. His eyes flicked toward Helen, then to the table where Jasmine had sat, and then down to the floor. He left without looking back. The bell above the door gave a weak jingle as it shut behind him, the sound smaller now, like even it had learned to be quiet. Outside, the sun climbed a little higher in the sky, but inside the diner, the light felt harsher, more revealing. It streamed through the front windows, cutting sharp angles across the booths, dust catching in the golden shafts like memory suspended in motion. Ray sat alone near the window, his posture rigid. One hand rested on his thigh, the other clenched loosely around a coffee cup he hadn't sipped from in 10 minutes. His eyes weren't on the room. They were far away, on a battlefield maybe, or a memory, or the place where regret starts to root itself when pride finally steps out of the way. Dale poured himself a glass of water and drank it too quickly. Then he refilled it. No one had told him to do anything, but doing something felt better than doing nothing. The dishwasher in the back clanged faintly. He had left it running earlier, unaware. Now its hum felt like a lifeline to normalcy, to routine. But it didn't work. Not anymore. The waitress who had frozen at the register earlier moved gently between tables, refilling cups, not saying much. She nodded politely to customers and made a point of asking Ray if he wanted a fresh pour. He declined with a slight shake of his head, eyes still fixed on the window as if waiting for something, or someone, to return. Helen finally reached for the letter. Her fingers touched the paper like it might vanish. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She had read the words once. Now they lived in her chest like an old injury finally acknowledged. She folded it again, more carefully this time, and slid it into the front pocket of her apron. Then she stood, slowly, deliberately, and carried the empty coffee mug back behind the counter herself. No one said a word, because everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, understood the same truth. Something had ended. Not the conversation, not the conflict, but the illusion that this diner, this town, this country could keep running on silence. And outside, down the road, Jasmine Crockett kept walking. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The aftershock would take care of itself. It wasn't until the diner had emptied that Helen realized how still she was. The chairs had been reset, the plates cleared. The bell above the door hadn't jingled in nearly 20 minutes. And yet, Helen remained rooted in place behind the counter, one hand resting on the cold porcelain mug Jasmine had left behind, the other loosely cradling the folded letter in her apron pocket. She felt like a ghost in her own business. For years, Dale's diner had been her sanctuary, her inheritance, her control. She knew the rhythm of it better than she knew the rhythms of her own breath. She could tell which regular was coming just by the cadence of their boots across the floor. She could fry eggs and count change at the same time without thinking. She was the woman who knew how many packets of sugar went into Ray's coffee when Marcus would come in hungover, and exactly how many minutes the jukebox took to warm up in winter. But today she had been a stranger behind her own counter, and now the weight of it pressed on her chest like a truth too long denied. She reached into her apron pocket and slowly pulled out the letter. Her fingers trembled. It wasn't age. It was knowing. Knowing that this piece of paper, this fragile slip of memory, had been in someone else's hands for decades while she lived under the illusion that she understood her father. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases out along the countertop like she was unwrapping a confession. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's. She hadn't seen it in years, but it came back to her instantly. The slightly crooked S, the way he pressed harder on the first letter of every sentence. He had written this, to a black woman, to Jasmine's mother, an apology, signed with his name, Sheriff Walter S. Kendrick, the man who had been her rock, her compass, her foundation, the man who had stood in her kitchen every Sunday, reading scripture with his thumb tucked into the spine of the Bible, the man whose photograph hung in her office, dressed in full uniform, frozen in a smile that now looked unfamiliar. She had worshipped him, and he had written this letter in silence, without ever telling her. What did that mean? What did that say? She read the letter again, this time slower. Words like misjudgment, wrongful, apology jumped out at her like bullets. Her breath caught at one line in particular. I carried out the law that day, but I did not carry out justice. And for that, I owe you something I can never repay. Helen stared at that sentence as though it were a sentence handed down to her, not him. It echoed in her mind like a verdict read aloud in a courtroom she didn't know she'd been sitting in her entire life. Justice was not done in your name, she thought. But you let me believe it was. The truth was unraveling her carefully folded world. She had inherited more than a business from her father. She had inherited silence. She had inherited a place built on knowing what not to ask. She had heard stories, of course, rumors of that arrest, murmurs of what really happened. But she had never asked, never wanted to know. And now here it was, on her counter, on her conscience, staring back at her through a daughter's eyes, Jasmine's eyes. Helen sat down slowly, her knees tight and tired from a morning that had bent her in ways no shift ever had. She looked across the table at the empty chair where Jasmine had sat and felt for the first time in years that she was not in control of her space. The diner no longer belonged only to her, not morally, not emotionally, because something had been named here, something she couldn't unhear, not politics, not partisanship, truth. The kind that comes with a quiet face and a patient voice, the kind that walks in through the front door and asks for nothing but a cup of coffee and the dignity of being seen, and the kind that lingers long after that person has walked out. Helen folded the letter again, this time with more reverence, and slipped it back into her apron like someone tucking away a sacred object. She didn't know what she would do with it yet. Maybe she'd frame it. Maybe she'd write her own letter and deliver it herself. She didn't know. But she knew this. The next time someone like Jasmine walked into her diner, she would not be surprised. Because today she had finally looked inward. And what she saw was not cruelty, but cowardice. And cowardice, she realized, is just another word for comfort when it's chosen over courage. She stood again, slower this time, worn, not from work, but from truth. The photograph of her father still hung on the back office wall. She looked at it now, and for the first time it didn't offer strength, it offered accountability. She walked back to the photo, removed it from the nail, looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it face down in the drawer. Not as an erasure, but as a reckoning. And she locked the drawer with shaking hands, whispering aloud to the empty room, "I should have asked more questions." By the time the clock tower in Elmswood chimed 7 the next morning, the events at Dale's Diner had already begun to mutate, softened in some corners, sharpened in others. The town didn't have breaking news alerts or TV reporters camped on its sidewalks. It had something older, more efficient: gossip, shame, pride, and memory. The first retelling happened not in headlines but in eye contact, in the way two men who usually nodded politely outside the feeding grain suddenly held each other's gaze half a second longer. The way mothers looked up from their grocery list when someone mentioned that woman near the produce aisle, and how conversations now came with cautious pauses. The diner incident, some refused to call it anything more than that, didn't scream its way through Elmswood. It whispered, insisted, haunted. By 8, local Facebook groups were lighting up, screens filled with speculation, screenshots, and blurry images. One photo in particular showed Jasmine Crockett seated across from Helen, her hands calmly folded on the table, her expression unreadable. Helen leaned forward in that image, face taut with something between skepticism and surrender. No food between them, just silence and decades. One user posted, "Didn't see that on the menu." Another replied, "Looks like something finally got served." Beneath the snide comments came a quieter layer. Teachers who had taught both Helen's children and Jasmine's niece chimed in. "I don't care what side you're on. She carried herself with more grace than most of us would have." A Black War veteran posted a single sentence. "I've eaten at Dale's since 1973. Not once did I feel seen in that room. Yesterday changed something." By 10, the Elmswood Weekly Gazette's homepage posted a brief write-up under the heading, "A Table Between Generations, Diner Encounter, Sparks Reflection." The article was cautious, almost clinical. No mention of the letter, no names except Helen's, and even that was quoted lightly. But the headline was enough. The Gazette hadn't used the word reflection in years. Usually stories were about lost dogs, church bake-offs, and the annual Veterans Day parade. This one felt different. It felt nervous. At the high school, teachers held whispered conversations in the break room. One math teacher, a white woman in her 50s, asked if anyone had seen the full video. "No video," someone responded. "Only memory." That answer stuck with her all day. She repeated it to herself like a problem she couldn't solve. At the salon, three women sat under dryers arguing about what Jasmine had said or hadn't said. None of them had been there, but they debated like they had. When the stylist, a younger Latina woman, said, "You know, I'd have probably walked out if I were her," the room went quiet. Someone muttered, "That's because you don't understand how small towns work." She looked up through the mirror and replied evenly, "Maybe that's the problem. We're too afraid to say they're broken." At the VFW, Ray sat alone at the corner table, nursing a single beer well past the time it had gone warm. He didn't tell the story. He didn't have to. The others watched him closely, waiting for a snide comment or a dismissal, but it never came. Instead, when someone finally said, "Heard you shook her hand," Ray just nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I did. Felt right." No one mocked him for it. They just moved on to the next round of cards. But everyone knew something had changed. The ripple extended beyond conversations. It became action too, small at first. That same day, a librarian pulled a stack of books on civil rights and placed them in the front display. A father stopped by the diner with his teenage daughter and told her quietly before they entered, "Pay attention to how people treat each other today." A black waitress at a diner 2 counties over heard someone say Jasmine's name and pause, wondering if, just maybe, things were starting to feel a little less impossible. Meanwhile, Helen was still navigating her own shift, not just socially, but inside. She came into Dale's earlier than ever, and scrubbed the counters not because they needed it, but because her thoughts wouldn't stop moving. Every motion was loaded with memory, every dish, every stool, every faded newspaper clipping on the bulletin board now felt like part of a story she hadn't been honest about. She thought about her father often that day. She thought about what he didn't tell her, but more than that, she thought about what she had never questioned. When a young black woman came into the diner around lunchtime, Helen walked up to her personally and said, "Welcome. Here or to go?" The woman blinked, startled, then smiled and said, "Here, if that's all right." Helen nodded. "Of course it is." That moment wasn't performative. It wasn't political. It was human. And still the town kept talking. On the third day after the diner incident, a group of high school seniors asked to host a community discussion in the church basement. The flyer read, "We're not asking you to agree, just to listen." Some laughed at it, others showed up, but the room was packed, and when Jasmine's name was brought up, there were no boos, no applause, just silence. The same silence she had held in that diner, the same silence that had made people stop and feel instead of argue. In that silence, people remembered what had happened and what hadn't. Not everyone agreed with what she stood for, but more people than ever before were starting to wonder what it said about them, that she had walked into their town with truth and composure, and they had almost made her leave before she even ordered a cup of coffee. Some couldn't sleep that week, others slept better than they had in years. No laws changed, no banners were raised, but Elmswood wasn't quite the same, and neither was Helen. Because now, when the bell above the diner door chimed, it no longer meant business as usual. It meant someone was walking in, and this time, they might be seen. And as the days moved on and Elmswood slipped back into its familiar rhythm, the weight of what happened at Dale's diner didn't disappear. It sank deeper, not like a wound, but like a seed. Jasmine hadn't yelled, hadn't lectured, hadn't demanded anything but dignity. Yet with a letter, a gaze, and an unwavering calm, she had peeled back something raw in the heart of that town. She didn't storm the place. She stood in it. And that, more than anything, forced everyone to question what kind of silence they'd been living with for far too long. The lesson wasn't wrapped in politics. It wasn't partisan. It was painfully human. Jasmine faced a room designed to exclude her, not with violence, but with polite denial. And instead of meeting hostility with fire, she met it with history, humility, and the kind of stillness that made others shift in their seats. She didn't win anyone over with slogans. She disarmed them with truth. Her presence alone asked the question, why is being different still treated as a threat? What she showed Elmswood, and anyone listening, is this: coexistence doesn't require sameness. It requires courage. The courage to stay at the table. The courage to hear before you respond. And above all, the courage to admit when silence has been your safest lie. Jasmine didn't change the world in that diner, but she did something braver. She made it impossible to look away. And for a town that had long chosen comfort over confrontation, that was more than enough to begin. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.